Imagine for a moment that you could remember every injury, every disappointment, every moment of pain you've ever experienced, every cruel word whispered in your direction, every betrayal, every failure, all etched into your mind with the precision of a digital archive. Do you believe this would make you stronger? Wiser? The answer, according to one of history's most provocative philosophers, is a categorical no. Friedrich Nietzsche, the hammer of philosophers, the man who proclaimed the death of God and challenged the moral foundations of the West, bequeathed us a disturbing truth. Our cultural obsession with memory, with remembering everything, archiving every experience, collecting every grievance, is not virtue, but pathology. We live in an age of hypertrophied memory, where every moment is documented, every trauma is preserved, every resentment is cultivated like a poisonous plant in our hearts. The universal problem we face is not forgetting. It's the inability to forget. We carry the dead weight of the past like invisible shackles, preventing us from moving forward with the lightness and power that life demands. In our therapeutic culture, we're told to remember, to process, to never let go. But Nietzsche saw this differently. He understood that the ability to forget is not a weakness to be overcome, but a strength to be cultivated. Throughout this essay, we will dissect Nietzsche's radical doctrine of active forgetting. First, we will diagnose the 4 pillars of what he called the sickness of memory, the ways in which our inability to forget transforms us into resentful, reactive beings. Then, we will extract the 4 principles of what he termed the art of forgetting, the active cultivation of selective amnesia as a tool of self-creation. Prepare yourself, for the knowledge that follows is a map for liberation from the tyranny of the past and the birth of what Nietzsche called the overman, the one who creates himself anew each day. Man is the only animal burdened by his past, and this burden can crush the very life force within him. Nietzsche identified what he called the historical sickness, the modern condition where human beings become so overwhelmed by the weight of memory that they lose the capacity for spontaneous action. Unlike animals, who live in what he called the eternal now, humans are cursed with historical consciousness. We remember not just facts, but feelings. Not just events, but their emotional This burden creates what Nietzsche termed the historical man, a being so weighed down by knowledge of past suffering, past failures, past injustices, that he becomes paralyzed. The historical man cannot act decisively because every action is filtered through the lens of previous disappointments. He cannot love fully because he remembers past betrayals. He cannot create boldly because he recalls past failures. Neuroplasticity research has vindicated Nietzsche's intuition. Our brains literally reshape themselves around traumatic memories, creating neural pathways that make us more likely to perceive threats, more prone to defensive reactions, more inclined toward the negative. We become prisoners of our own biological memory systems. Consider the case of the Habsburg Empire in its final centuries. Once a dynamic, expanding force in European politics, it became paralyzed by its own glorious history. Every decision was weighed against past greatness. Every innovation was measured against former glory. The empire's leadership became curators of memory rather than architects of the future. In the court of Vienna, officials would spend months debating how their ancestors would have handled each situation. They created vast bureaucratic systems designed to preserve traditional ways of doing things. Ministers would quote precedents from centuries past as reasons why new approaches wouldn't work. The empire became a living museum, beautiful but lifeless. By 1914, while other European powers were embracing industrial innovation and modern military tactics, the Habsburg military was still operating with strategies and hierarchies designed for 18th century warfare. They had become, in Nietzsche's terms, historically sick, so burdened by their past that they couldn't adapt to present realities. The empire that had once terrified Europe became its most tragic anachronism, finally collapsing not from external pressure, but from internal ossification. In our digital age, this historical sickness has metastasized. Social media platforms create permanent archives of our mistakes, our awkward phases, our poorly thought-out opinions. We carry smartphones filled with photos of ex-lovers, screenshots of arguments, reminders of every embarrassing moment. We've externalized our memory and made it permanent. Consider the modern phenomenon of cancel culture, the digital excavation of past statements and actions to judge present character. We've created a society where nothing is truly forgotten, where every past mistake becomes ammunition for present destruction. People live in terror of their own histories, unable to evolve because they're forever chained to who they were. Each evening, consciously decide what from the day deserves to be remembered and what should be discarded. Train your mind to actively forget trivial slights, minor embarrassments, and unproductive thoughts. Regularly examine which past events you're still carrying and ask, does remembering this serve my future self, or does it merely feed my resentment? Periodically delete old photos, clear browsing histories, and remove digital reminders of past selves that no longer serve your evolution. Memory without forgetting transforms every slight into a permanent wound, every disappointment into a source of lifelong bitterness. Nietzsche's concept of ressentiment, his French spelling was intentional, distinguishing it from simple resentment, describes a psychological condition where individuals define themselves primarily through their grievances against others. This is not the healthy anger that motivates change, but a toxic brew of impotence and memory that poisons the soul. The person trapped in ressentiment cannot forget, because their identity depends on remembering injustices. They become what Nietzsche called men of ressentiment, beings who find meaning not in their own creative power, but in cataloging the ways they've been wronged. Their memory becomes a weapon turned against themselves, a constant reminder of their victimization. This psychological pattern creates what modern psychology recognizes as rumination, the compulsive rehearsal of negative events. Neuroscientist Daniel Siegel's research shows that rumination literally changes brain structure, strengthening neural pathways associated with negative thinking, while weakening those connected to problem-solving and creativity. The most tragic example of institutionalized ressentiment in history may be the relationship between Serbia and Kosovo following the Battle of Kosovo in 1389. What began as a military defeat became, over 6 centuries, the defining mythology of Serbian national identity. Serbian poets, priests, and politicians transformed the memory of Kosovo into what they called the Heavenly Serbia, a spiritual wound that could never heal because it was never supposed to heal. Generation after generation was raised on epic poems that glorified defeat, that celebrated suffering, that made victimhood into virtue. The Battle of Kosovo became more than history. It became the lens through which all subsequent events were interpreted. Every political decision was filtered through this ancient grievance. Serbian leaders would invoke Kosovo to justify everything from medieval rebellions to modern ethnic cleansing. The battle cry, "Remember Kosovo," echoed through centuries, each repetition deepening the wound rather than healing it. By the 20th century, this cultural ressentiment had produced leaders like Slobodan Milošević, who built their entire political careers on promises to avenge ancient wrongs. The inability to forget Kosovo didn't strengthen Serbian culture. It trapped it in cycles of violence that ultimately devastated the region. The memory that was meant to preserve Serbian greatness instead ensured its perpetual suffering. We see this same pattern in modern identity politics, where entire movements organize around historical grievances. While acknowledging past injustices is important for justice, the inability to move beyond them creates what Nietzsche would recognize as ressentiment-based thinking. Consider how many people today define themselves primarily through their oppression rather than their potential. They become experts in their own victimization, able to recite every slight, every microaggression, every instance of unfairness. But this expertise in suffering rarely translates into expertise in thriving. On social media, we see grievance collectors, people who seem to find energy and purpose in accumulating and sharing stories of how they've been wronged. Their feeds become museums of resentment, and their identities become inseparable from their injuries. Make a list of everyone you feel has wronged you. For each entry, ask, am I keeping this memory to learn from it, or am I feeding off it? Choose one day per week where you consciously refuse to rehearse any grievances. When resentful thoughts arise, redirect your attention to creative projects. When you catch yourself thinking like a victim, immediately ask, what can I create from this experience? Transform every wound into a source of creative energy. The man who remembers everything remembers nothing of importance, for he cannot distinguish between the trivial and the essential. Nietzsche observed that perfect memory is not perfect wisdom, it's perfect paralysis. When we remember everything with equal intensity, We lose the ability to prioritize, to focus, to act with conviction. The mind becomes like a hoarder's house, so cluttered with memories that nothing useful can be found when needed. This insight predated modern cognitive science by a century, but neuroscience has validated it completely. Studies of individuals with hyperthymesia, the inability to forget autobiographical memories, show that rather than being blessed with superior recall, they're often paralyzed by it. They remember every trivial conversation, every minor disappointment, every mundane detail with the same intensity as major life events. The brain's natural forgetting mechanisms aren't bugs in the system. They're features. Memory consolidation involves an active process of forgetting irrelevant details while strengthening important connections. When this process fails, the mind becomes cluttered with useless information that interferes with clear thinking. Nietzsche understood that creativity requires what he called active forgetting, the deliberate cultivation of mental space through the elimination of unnecessary memories. The artist, the philosopher, the leader must be able to clear their mental palette to perceive new possibilities. The Library of Alexandria represents one of history's grandest experiments in perfect preservation, and its ultimate failure illustrates Nietzsche's point about the paralysis of comprehensive memory. Founded in the 3rd century BCE, the library aimed to collect all human knowledge. Scholars like Callimachus created detailed catalogues, attempting to organize and preserve every text, every scroll, every fragment of written wisdom. The library became a monument to human memory, a place where nothing would ever be forgotten. But as the library grew, a curious thing happened. Original thinking began to decline. Scholars became so obsessed with cataloging and preserving existing knowledge that they stopped creating new knowledge. They became librarians rather than philosophers, curators rather than creators. The later scholars of Alexandria were encyclopedic in their memory, but sterile in their imagination. They could quote thousands of texts, but struggled to write original ones. They knew every opinion that had ever been expressed on every topic, but this comprehensive knowledge paralyzed them rather than empowering them. How could they say anything new when they remembered everything that had already been said? By the time of its decline, the library had become what Nietzsche would have recognized as a monument to historical sickness, a place where the weight of accumulated knowledge had crushed the spirit of inquiry that originally created it. The scholars had become so burdened by the past that they lost the ability to create the future. We live in the age of the digital library of Alexandria. Google gives us access to virtually all recorded human knowledge. Social media creates permanent archives of every thought, every conversation, every fleeting emotion. We're drowning in data but starving for wisdom. Consider the modern phenomenon of analysis paralysis, the inability to make decisions because we have access to too much information. We research endlessly, read countless reviews, gather infinite data points, but all this information often makes us less decisive, not more. Many entrepreneurs and creators report that their productivity improved dramatically once they stopped consuming so much information. They realized that knowing about every possible approach, every potential pitfall, every historical precedent was actually preventing them from taking action. Limit your daily consumption of news, social media, and random information to specific time windows. Treat information like food. Too much makes you sluggish. Regularly categorize your memories into 3 tiers: essential, useful, and clutter. Focus your mental energy on the first tier. Once per month, choose an area of your life where you'll consciously forget past approaches and start with a beginner's mind. Man's greatest enemy is not his circumstances, but his attachment to who he used to be. Nietzsche's most radical insight was that the self is not a fixed entity, but a creative project. However, memory creates what he called the illusion of the unified self. The false belief that we are the same person we were yesterday, last year, or a decade ago. This illusion becomes a prison. When we remember our past selves too vividly, we become trapped by their limitations. The person who remembers being shy continues to act shy, even when shyness no longer serves them. The person who remembers being a victim continues to see the world through victim's eyes, even when they have the power to change their circumstances. Nietzsche understood that true growth requires what he called self-overcoming, the willingness to kill off past versions of ourselves. But this death is impossible if we cling too tightly to memories of who we used to be. We become archaeologists of our own limitations, constantly excavating evidence of our former weaknesses. Modern neuroscience supports this view through research on neuroplasticity. The brain's ability to rewire itself is hampered by strong attachment to existing neural patterns. People who successfully change their lives often report feeling like they forgot who they used to be. They stopped reinforcing old neural pathways through constant remembering. Few figures in history illustrate the power of forgetting past selves better than Theodore Roosevelt. As a child, Roosevelt was sickly, asthmatic, and physically weak. By all accounts, he should have become a scholarly recluse. But Roosevelt made a conscious decision to forget his weak past self and create a new identity. He didn't simply overcome his physical limitations, he actively forgot them. In his autobiographical writings, Roosevelt rarely dwells on his sickly youth. Instead, he wrote as if he had always been the robust, adventurous figure he became. This wasn't deception, it was strategic forgetting. Roosevelt deliberately cultivated memories of strength while allowing memories of weakness to fade. He surrounded himself with stories of courage, adventure, and physical prowess. He practiced what psychologists now call selective attention, focusing so intensely on his desired identity that contrary evidence simply didn't register. The transformation was so complete that people who met Roosevelt as an adult could hardly believe accounts of his frail youth. He had literally forgotten himself into a new existence. The weak, asthmatic boy didn't evolve into the Rough Rider. He was abandoned by him. This pattern continued throughout Roosevelt's life. When he failed at cattle ranching, he forgot the failure and remembered the adventure. When he lost political battles, he forgot the defeats and remembered the principles. Each transformation required leaving behind a previous version of himself. In our therapy-obsessed culture, we're often encouraged to remember and process every aspect of our past selves. But this can become counterproductive. Some people become so attached to their trauma narratives, their origin stories, their past identities, that they can't evolve beyond them. Consider people who define themselves by childhood trauma that occurred decades ago. While understanding the past can be helpful, some individuals become so identified with their wounded inner child that they can't access their adult power. They remain frozen in patterns that made sense for a hurt child, but serve no purpose for a grown adult. Social media exacerbates this problem by creating permanent archives of our past selves. Old photos, old posts, old relationships are constantly dredged up, preventing us from naturally evolving beyond them. We're trapped in museums of our former identities. Every 6 months, list the ways you currently describe yourself. Ask, which of these self-descriptions no longer serve me? Which past versions of myself am I ready to forget? Choose periods where you consciously avoid reminiscing about past versions of yourself. When others bring up how you used to be, politely redirect to who you're becoming. Write a detailed description of who you want to be 5 years from now. Read it regularly while allowing memories of incompatible past selves to fade. So far, we have excavated the foundations of what Nietzsche called the sickness of memory. You've learned to recognize the burden of historical consciousness that paralyzes action, the resentment machine that turns every slight into a permanent wound, the paralysis of perfect memory that drowns wisdom in trivia, and the addiction to past selves that prevents growth and transformation. But recognizing the disease is only the first step. Now, we enter deeper and more dangerous territory, the active cultivation of forgetting as a creative force. The lessons that follow are not for those who content themselves with understanding. They demand courage, discipline, and the willingness to destroy in order to create. Nietzsche called this the art of forgetting, the conscious cultivation of selective amnesia in service of self-creation. Prepare yourself, for these are not passive insights, but active tools for the transformation of your very being. True strength lies not in remembering everything, but in choosing what deserves to be remembered. Nietzsche distinguished between passive forgetting, the natural decay of unused memories, and active forgetting, the deliberate cultivation of amnesia for strategic purposes. Active forgetting is not suppression or denial, but conscious curation. It's the mental equivalent of pruning a garden, removing what stunts growth to allow what's essential to flourish. This concept aligns with modern research on memory reconsolidation. Every time we recall a memory, it becomes temporarily unstable and can be modified or even eliminated through conscious intervention. Neuroscientist Karim Nader's work shows that memories are not fixed recordings, but dynamic reconstructions that can be intentionally altered. Nietzsche understood that the mind, like a computer, has limited processing power. Every mental resource devoted to maintaining useless memories is a resource unavailable for creative thinking. The art of active forgetting is the art of mental optimization, keeping only what serves your highest purposes while discarding the rest. This practice requires what Nietzsche called amor fati, love of fate, which includes love of the fate of forgetting. Rather than mourning lost memories, we celebrate their disappearance as the price of mental clarity and creative power. Perhaps no historical figure better exemplifies active forgetting than Napoleon Bonaparte. Despite facing numerous defeats, betrayals, and setbacks throughout his career, Napoleon possessed an almost supernatural ability to forget failures, while retaining only the lessons they offered. After his devastating retreat from Moscow in 1812, Napoleon could have been paralyzed by memories of the frozen corpses of his Grande Armée, the strategic blunders that led to disaster, the political humiliation of defeat. Instead, within months, he was raising new armies and planning new campaigns with the same confidence he'd always possessed. His contemporaries noted that Napoleon seemed to have no emotional attachment to past failures. He would analyze them briefly for tactical lessons, then discard the emotional residue completely. He practiced what we might call surgical memory, extracting useful information while discarding everything that might hamper future performance. This ability served him even in exile on Elba. Rather than wallowing in memories of lost empire, Napoleon immediately began planning his return. He forgot the bitterness of defeat, but remembered every detail that might contribute to future victory. His 100-day return to power was possible precisely because he had forgotten how to be defeated. Even in his final exile on St. Helena, Napoleon continued this practice. He actively forgot the details of his failures while constructing the legend that would outlive him. He transformed himself from a defeated emperor into an immortal symbol through the strategic cultivation of certain memories and the active forgetting of others. In our age of permanent digital records, active forgetting requires conscious effort. We must actively choose what to maintain in our mental space and what to discard. This is particularly crucial for entrepreneurs and creators who face constant rejection and failure. Consider how successful salespeople practice active forgetting. They might remember the lessons from a failed pitch while actively forgetting the emotional sting of rejection. They train themselves to extract value from experience while discarding the psychological baggage that could hamper future performance. Many successful individuals report similar practices. They remember strategic lessons while forgetting personal slights. They retain useful information while discarding negative emotions. They learn from mistakes while forgetting the shame associated with them. Each evening, consciously decide which experiences from the day deserve permanent storage and which should be actively forgotten. Rehearse the valuable lessons while consciously releasing emotional attachments to negative events. When recalling past failures or traumas, actively separate the useful information from the emotional payload. Keep the lesson, discard the suffering. Once weekly, spend time consciously forgetting old grudges, outdated self-limiting beliefs, embarrassing moments that serve no purpose. Treat your mind like a garden that needs regular weeding. The wise man forgets his defeats, but remembers his victories, not from vanity, but from necessity. Nietzsche argued that selective amnesia is not self-deception, but survival strategy. In nature, organisms that dwell on past threats often become paralyzed and fail to pursue new opportunities. The gazelle that constantly remembers the lion's attack may become too fearful to graze. Human beings, with their complex memory systems, face the same evolutionary challenge. Selective amnesia involves consciously reinforcing positive memories while allowing negative ones to fade. This isn't toxic positivity or denial. It's strategic attention management. We acknowledge that painful experiences occurred, extract whatever lessons they offer, then consciously shift our mental focus to experiences that build confidence and capability. Modern positive psychology research supports this approach. Studies show that people who naturally focus more attention on positive memories tend to be more resilient, more creative, and more successful in achieving their goals. They're not delusional. They're simply using their limited cognitive resources more strategically. The key insight is that our memories shape our identity, and our identity shapes our actions. If we remember ourselves primarily as victims, failures, or sufferers, we'll tend to act from those identities. If we remember ourselves as creators, overcomers, and victors, we'll act from those identities instead. Winston Churchill's career provides a masterclass in strategic selective amnesia. Throughout his long political life, Churchill faced numerous failures, defeats, and humiliating setbacks. The Gallipoli disaster alone should have ended his career. His wilderness years in the 1930s, when he was mocked as a warmongering has-been, could have broken his spirit permanently. But Churchill possessed what his biographers noted as an almost supernatural ability to forget defeats, while vividly remembering victories and vindications. He didn't deny his failures occurred. He simply refused to let them occupy mental real estate that could be better used for planning future victories. During World War II, when Britain faced seemingly impossible odds, Churchill drew upon a carefully curated memory palace of British triumphs: Agincourt, Trafalgar, Waterloo. He consciously reinforced memories of times when Britain had faced superior odds and prevailed, while actively forgetting or minimizing memories of defeats and retreats. This wasn't mere propaganda for public consumption. Churchill genuinely seemed to live in a mental world where British victory was the natural order of things, because that's the only history he chose to remember vividly. He transformed selective amnesia into strategic leadership, inspiring a nation by forgetting its vulnerabilities and remembering its strengths. His speeches during the Blitz demonstrate this perfectly. While bombs fell on London, Churchill spoke as if British victory was inevitable, drawing on carefully selected historical precedents while conveniently forgetting any evidence that might suggest otherwise. In our current culture of comprehensive documentation and trauma processing, the art of selective amnesia has been almost entirely lost. We're encouraged to remember everything, process everything, keep detailed records of every slight and setback. But this comprehensive memory often becomes comprehensive paralysis. Consider the difference between successful entrepreneurs and those who remain stuck. Successful entrepreneurs tend to remember their wins vividly, while their failures fade into useful but emotionally neutral lessons. They tell stories about their victories at cocktail parties, not their defeats. This isn't vanity, it's strategic identity construction. Failed entrepreneurs often do the opposite. They remember every setback in vivid detail, while their successes fade into modest acknowledgments. They become expert historians of their own limitations, while remaining ignorant of their own capabilities. Keep a detailed record of your wins, breakthroughs, and moments of strength. Review this regularly, while allowing memories of defeats to naturally fade into simple lessons learned. Actively collect and rehearse stories of times when you overcame obstacles, succeeded against odds, or demonstrated capabilities you didn't know you had. When telling the story of your life to others or to yourself, consciously choose to emphasize victories and growth while minimizing defeats and setbacks. Shape your identity through strategic storytelling. Every man is imprisoned by the stories he tells himself about who he is, and freedom begins with burning those stories to the ground. Nietzsche understood that human beings are storytelling animals. We make sense of our lives by constructing narratives about who we are, where we came from, and where we're going. But these narratives, once formed, become prisons. We start living to maintain consistency with our self-stories, rather than living to fulfill our potential. The most dangerous stories are those that limit our sense of what's possible. I'm not good with money. I'm not a morning person. I'm not creative. I come from a family of failures. These narratives, supported by selective memories, become self-fulfilling prophecies. Nietzsche's concept of eternal recurrence was partially designed to shatter these limiting narratives. He asked, if you had to live your exact life over and over again for eternity, would you change anything? This thought experiment forces us to confront how many of our life patterns are simply habits of narrative, rather than inevitable facts. The destruction of limiting narratives requires what Nietzsche called philosophizing with a hammer, the systematic destruction of assumptions we've never questioned. This is painful work, because our narratives provide psychological comfort, even when they limit our growth. Frederick Douglass provides perhaps the most powerful example in history, of actively destroying limiting narratives through the conscious reconstruction of memory and identity. Born into slavery, Douglas could have been imprisoned for life by the narrative that he was property, that he was inherently inferior, that his place in the world was predetermined by his birth. But Douglas recognized that these narratives, though supported by overwhelming social and legal evidence, were constructions rather than truths. He began systematically destroying them by creating alternative memories and stories about himself. When he secretly learned to read, despite laws forbidding slave literacy, Douglas didn't just acquire a skill. He consciously rewrote his self-narrative from "I am property" to "I am a human being capable of learning." Each book he read provided new evidence for this alternative story. Most remarkably, Douglas actively forgot the psychological conditioning of slavery while retaining the intellectual understanding of its horrors. He deliberately constructed memories of dignity and self-respect to replace internalized narratives of inferiority. He chose to remember moments when he felt human pride while consciously releasing memories that reinforced slavish thinking. After escaping slavery, Douglas could have been trapped by a victim narrative. "I am a person who was enslaved." Instead, he actively reconstructed his identity around freedom and advocacy. "I am a person who chose freedom and helps others choose it too." This wasn't denial of his past, but strategic reframing of its meaning. His autobiographical works demonstrate this process explicitly. Douglas remembered his experiences of slavery not as evidence of his victimization, but as proof of his ultimate triumph over oppression. Most people today are imprisoned by far less dramatic but equally limiting narratives. They remember evidence that supports their limitations, while forgetting evidence that contradicts them. They become curators of their own inadequacy. Consider someone who believes "I'm bad with technology." This person will vividly remember every time they struggled with a device while forgetting or minimizing every successful digital interaction. They'll construct an identity around technological incompetence that becomes more real than any objective assessment of their capabilities. The same pattern applies to narratives about creativity, intelligence, social skills, leadership ability, or any other human capacity. People collect evidence for their limitations while discarding evidence for their potential. List the stories you tell yourself about your limitations. For each limiting narrative, actively search your memory for contradictory evidence. Begin constructing alternative stories based on your successes and growth. Choose one limiting belief about yourself and act as if it weren't true for 30 days. Notice what memories and evidence you've been ignoring that support this alternative identity. Take your most painful memories and practice telling them as stories of strength rather than stories of victimization. Focus on what you survived, learned, or overcame rather than what was done to you. The highest men do not merely remember their past. They create it retroactively through the power of interpretation. Nietzsche's most advanced insight was that memory is not passive recording, but active creation. We don't simply remember what happened. We constantly recreate our past through the lens of present understanding. This creative power over memory is what separates the overman from the reactive mass of humanity. Mythic memory involves consciously transforming personal history into legend, reinterpreting past events in ways that support your highest aspirations rather than your lowest fears. This isn't self-deception, but what Nietzsche called creative interpretation, the artist's relationship to their own life story. Every great leader, artist, and innovator practices mythic memory to some degree. They take the raw material of their experience and consciously craft it into narratives that serve their creative power. They become the authors of their own legend while still living it. This practice requires what Nietzsche called amor fati, love of fate, including the fate of transforming even painful experiences into sources of strength and wisdom. The practitioner of mythic memory sees themselves as the hero of their own epic rather than the victim of circumstances. No figure better illustrates the power of mythic memory than Steve Jobs. Throughout his career, Jobs consciously transformed setbacks, failures, and personal limitations into elements of a heroic narrative that ultimately became reality. When Jobs was fired from Apple in 1985, he could have remembered this as evidence of his inadequacy as a leader or businessman. Instead, he actively reconstructed this experience as necessary preparation for his ultimate triumph. He told the story as if his exile from Apple was a hero's journey that would make his return more meaningful. Jobs practiced what can only be called mythic memory. He remembered his childhood adoption not as abandonment, but as evidence that he was chosen for something special. He remembered his early interest in Eastern philosophy not as youthful experimentation, but as spiritual preparation for technological leadership. Most remarkably, Jobs actively forgot or reinterpreted evidence that contradicted his heroic self-narrative. His well-documented interpersonal difficulties were reframed as necessary perfectionism. His business failures became learning experiences that prepared him for greater success. By the time Jobs returned to Apple, he had so completely transformed his personal history through mythic memory that he seemed to genuinely believe in his own legend. He spoke about his career as if every setback had been strategically planned. Every failure had been necessary education. Every limitation had been a source of ultimate strength. This mythic approach to memory became a source of tremendous creative and leadership power. Jobs inspired others not just through his vision for the future, but through his mythic interpretation of the past. He had transformed himself from a failed executive into a legendary figure through the conscious application of mythic memory. In our therapeutic culture, we're often encouraged to remember traumatic experiences accurately and process them honestly. But mythic memory suggests a different approach. Rather than being enslaved by factual accuracy, we can choose interpretations of our past that serve our highest aspirations. This doesn't mean lying to ourselves or others about what happened. It means consciously choosing which aspects of our experience deserve emphasis and which interpretations of events will best serve our growth and contribution to the world. Many successful people unconsciously practice elements of mythic memory. They tell their career stories as heroic journeys where every setback prepared them for greater achievement. They remember their childhood difficulties as the source of their strength rather than their limitations. Take the 3 most difficult experiences of your life and consciously rewrite them as heroic origin stories. Focus on what these experiences taught you, how they strengthened you, or how they prepared you for your current mission. Write your life story as if you were already a legendary figure being studied by future historians. What would they emphasize? What would they see as the meaningful patterns? Begin living up to that interpretation. Create a collection of stories about yourself that emphasize your growth, strength, and unique gifts. Practice telling these stories until they become more vivid and accessible than stories of limitation or victimization. We have completed a dangerous journey through the landscape of memory and forgetting. We began by diagnosing the 4 pillars of what Nietzsche called the sickness of memory, the paralyzing burden of historical consciousness that transforms us into curators rather than creators, the resentment machine that turns every slight into a permanent wound, the paralysis of perfect memory that drowns wisdom in trivia, and the addiction to past selves that prevents transformation. Then we entered the forbidden territory of active forgetting, mastering 4 advanced tactics that separate the reactive masses from what Nietzsche called the overman, the practice of active forgetting that treats memory as a garden requiring constant cultivation, the art of selective amnesia that consciously reinforces memories of strength while allowing memories of weakness to fade, the destruction of limiting narratives that imprison us in stories of inadequacy, and finally, the creation of mythic memory that transforms even painful experiences into sources of legendary strength. These 8 principles form a complete system, a technology of self-creation through strategic amnesia. The first 4 reveal how memory enslaves us. The last 4 show how forgetting liberates us. Together they offer a path from reactive victimhood to creative mastery, from historical sickness to mythic health. But let me be clear. This knowledge is not for the weak-hearted or the morally careless. The power to actively shape memory, to choose what you remember and what you forget, to transform your past through interpretation. This is the power of gods, and it carries the weight of divine responsibility. Use this knowledge to become stronger, wiser, more creative, more capable of contributing to the world. Use it to free yourself from the psychological prisons that keep you small and reactive. Use it to transform your pain into power, your setbacks into strength, your limitations into launching pads for transcendence. But never use it to escape accountability, to deny harm you've caused others, or to build your strength on others' weakness. The overman that Nietzsche envisioned was not a tyrant, but a creator. Someone so secure in their own power that they lifted others rather than diminishing them. Remember, the goal of forgetting is not to become detached from reality, but to become more powerfully engaged with it. We forget the emotional baggage of the past, not to avoid responsibility, but to take greater responsibility for the future. We practice selective amnesia not to deceive ourselves, but to free ourselves for more authentic action. The choice, as always, you can remain a prisoner of memory, forever rehearsing your grievances, limitations, or you can become an artist of forgetting, consciously crafting your past in service of your highest aspirations. The first path leads to resentment and reactivity. The second leads to what Nietzsche called amor fati, love of fate, and the birth of your own legend. In the comments below, I want you to share which of these 8 principles you find most challenging to implement and why. Is it the active forgetting that feels like betraying important memories? Is it the selective amnesia that seems dishonest? Is it the destruction of limiting narratives that feel like comfortable old friends? Your struggle with these concepts reveals exactly where your greatest growth potential lies. If this exploration of memory, forgetting, and self-creation resonates with the part of you that refuses to remain small, then subscribe to this channel. We dive deep into the most powerful and dangerous ideas in philosophy, psychology, and human potential. Ideas that can transform your life if you have the courage to apply them. And if you found value in this journey through Nietzsche's radical psychology of forgetting, give this video a like. Your engagement sends a signal that these ideas matter, that there are still people willing to think dangerously and live boldly in a world that often rewards neither. The power to forget is the power to be reborn. The question is, who will you choose to become?